we are starting the session. My name is Taeho, moderator of the session. First of all, I'd like to thank the symposium organizers for inviting us and other participants of the session and also the audience in this room. I think the title of our session, A New Paradigm for Trade Policy, Trumpism and the Challenges to the Multilateral Trading System, is very appropriate and very timely. This is more so since we are discussing the important trade issues in Buenos Aires, the very site of the WTO MC11. Furthermore, I'm extremely happy to note that we have excellent panels who are real experts on the topics we'd like to discuss in our session. Once again, I would like to especially thank the KIEP for inviting such distinguished panelists today. In our session, we means KIEP organizers selected 5 topics, kind of illustrative topics for the first round of discussion. We ask each panelist to speak for about 9 minutes or so, at the maximum 10 minutes for the initial remarks on a given topic. Of course, panelists are free to discuss other issues than a given topic. After the first round of discussion, panelists may have a brief time, very brief time, to ask questions or make comments among themselves. And then I will open the floor for interactions with the audience. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, Dr. Bernard Hoekman of European University Institute. We asked him to make his initial remarks on the topic of prospects of the WTO and the Doha round beyond MC11. Dr. Hoekman, please.
Thank you. So, I'm not a forecaster, so I'm not going to forecast. I think it's clear to everybody in this room that if we think about prospects for the WTO as opposed to prospects for the Doha round, I think the prospects for the WTO are a lot better than they are for the Doha round. Right? So I think we can all kind of make clear that the Doha round is going to go nowhere, is certainly not going to go anywhere at this ministerial, and is not going to go anywhere, period, I think. I think that is something which is clearly the issues that are at stake, that are being contested, are going to be there for quite a while, but it's actually also equally obvious, at least to me, that we're going to need a new approach to actually deal with these issues and at the same time deal with new issues that are confronting countries in the trading system. So I think, just as one aside, before we all start getting seriously depressed, I think it is important to note that a number of things were achieved in the context of the Doha round. So we do have a trade facilitation agreement. We do have an information technology agreement, which was expanded. We have, I think, as a community, done a much better job at dealing with economic development issues in terms of actually pointing the finger at the institutions that can do something about that, which are the multilateral development banks and the Aid for Trade initiative. But I think we also all know that the world has changed pretty dramatically since 2001. And one of the big things that, of course, has changed is the power dynamics, the economic relationships between countries, and in particular, the rise of China. And even though it doesn't get discussed a lot very explicitly, I think that is one of the reasons why the Doha round got stuck in the sand. And I think it's, again, worth reminding us all about how big a change that actually is, that China is now integrated into the world economy. So the share of value added in manufacturing that is actually generated by China today is around 25% of world value added, right? That's up from 5% when China joined the WTO. They're the largest exporter in the world now today, if you count EU trade as EU trade with the world and disregard intra-European trade. There's been a massive kind of hit, what people call the China shock, with respect to employment in manufacturing, which is driving a lot of opposition and concern and worries about where is this system going and what do we actually need to do to ensure that we as countries stay competitive and that we don't get swallowed up by this juggernaut. I'm of course exaggerating, but again, that's the kind of the dynamics that are out there, and they're real. So there have been really major shocks to the world economy. There's been major adjustment going on. And I think the fact of the matter is those shocks and adjustments are going to continue. And I think that's where the WTO comes in terms of the future, because we are shifting into a digital economy. We are, of course, have been talking a lot in the last 5-10 years or so about the implications of the global value chain, fragmentation of production, cross-hauling of foreign direct investment, and so forth, which is underlying a lot of these changes in trade shares and the global production shares. But a lot more is coming down the pike, which will have much more implications for labor markets and adjustment. And that's, I think, where, if you want to be positive about the prospects of the WTO, those dynamics are going to give rise to a need to cooperate on a number of policy areas that are important for allowing countries to actually benefit from these new technological changes and developments that have to do with the digital economy and trade in services. At the same time, one of the challenges for the WTO, and I think for governments in general with trade agreements, has been the backlash to globalization, not so much as a result of what people kind of put together under the umbrella of the China shock and what's happened to manufacturing employment in OECD countries, but also a lot of the agenda nowadays with respect to further integration of countries on trade and investment has to do with movement of factors of production. It has to do with regulatory heterogeneity. It has to do with differences in regulation across countries for particular processes or products. And increasingly, therefore, governments are going to have to deal with issues that have to do with consumer protection, that has to do with environmental regulation, that have to do with regulation of the labor market, things that are not trade issues, but that increasingly are on the agenda of trade agreements. And that's very difficult to deal with, and clearly that is not something you negotiate away through the mechanics that have been developed over 40 years in terms of how do we negotiate on a reciprocal basis on tariffs. On top of all of those changes, in terms of the challenge with respect to new types of policies that are generating negative spillovers for other countries that need to be addressed, either through bilateral, not through regional agreements with the WTO. A lot of those things have to be done globally, which is why the WTO remains very relevant. We have, on top of all of that, we have Mr. Trump and the new approach in the United States, of course, with respect to trade policy, which is essentially revolving around, can we please go back to the 1960s? That is not going to happen. But at the same time, I think a number of the things that have been on the table by the United States with respect to the functioning of the WTO, I would argue are quite valid things to talk about. Right? So there is an issue that has to do with the working practices of the WTO. There is, I think that there has been a long time, a general recognition that the consensus principle is being abused insofar as it pertains to the operation of the WTO, not so much about agreement on new rules, where I think consensus is a very good principle, but even just having discussions on issues. Right? So I think there is an issue there. I think there's a major issue with respect to special and differential treatment and how we deal with economic development. And for me there, the big disconnect is between what was actually done in the trade facilitation agreements in terms of actually getting together and talking a long time about what would actually make sense for everyone to do. Right? So those are the substantive provisions that we find in that agreement, and a recognition that not everybody can do that at the same time, so countries could define when they do things and link that to development assistance. Now that's a new approach towards dealing with economic development for the WTO. I think it's a good approach, and I think we really need to do a lot more to build on that type of an approach to address different issues and to think through much more kind of substantively what actually makes for good policy in terms of promoting economic development prospects, right? So I think the trade facilitation agreement is one where that was done. I think in lots of other areas that is not being done, and people are essentially stuck in their trenches and saying the same thing they've been saying for 30, 40 years, which increasingly, I would argue, is irrelevant from an economic development perspective because we're not in the 1960s, and I hope to God we're not going back to the 1960s when those types of arguments actually were relevant. So I think that's one of the challenges for the institution, and the question is how do we actually get a much more substantive process of discussion and self-reflection going in the WTO. right? And I think one of the problems here is that there is a lack of trust. There is a lot of kind of non-discussion going on, and I think really the challenge is how do you get that type of a substantive discussion going in the WTO? So I would argue a few kind of thoughts on that front is I would start by actually doing much more to actually understand why some parts of the WTO regime have done much better in terms of operations than others, right? So we have the SPS committee, we have the TBT committee, where over time a lot of things have happened and that are being done now as normal practice for those committees, which are not written down anywhere in the texts, right? So dealing with specific trade concerns, for example, is an example of that type of an approach, and I think there's a lot to be learned from within the organization as to what could we actually do to kind of replicate those examples of what I would call good practice into other areas. And I think that requires a process of actually explicitly thinking and discussing why certain things have worked well and other things have not been able to do that. I think we also need to have a much more open discussion about what I've called these working practices. And that includes things that are very sensitive, like consensus and the abuse of consensus, but I think that's something that needs to be confronted. And like I said, I think it really also has to do with taking economic development concerns much more seriously from a substantive point of view, as opposed to just saying we need everything that we thought we would get when we started the Doha round, because that is going to go nowhere. Part of that discussion has to deal with these new issues, right? So there's been a lot of attention given to e-commerce in the last year or so in the WTO. I think that's really important, but I think, again, we're nowhere near a situation where it actually makes sense to start negotiating anything. We really need to have a process which is much more focused on what do you actually need to do, where are the international policy spillovers, what actually makes sense from an economic development perspective, where we could use multilateral rules to promote development, which is, again, more this trade facilitation agreement model, where there was a lot of work with the World Customs Organization, with the multilateral development banks, to actually figure out what actually makes sense to do. Right now, that process really hasn't gone anywhere near enough, I think, on some of these other new issues, but could easily be emulated. And then finally, and I'll end with this is something which we're not going to be able to do with 164 countries around the table on every issue. And of course, in practice, the WTO doesn't work like that anyway, right? It works through working groups, it works through friends of, it works through various different constellations of countries that are interested in particular topics. But there again, I think there needs to be much more of a focus on encouraging that type of activity where it is done among subsets of WTO members that ideally down the road would lead to critical mass types of agreements like the information technology agreement, where countries accept that they're doing something which is good for them, which also benefits the rest of the world, and they don't necessarily expect everybody to join. I am also on record as saying we need to do more in the way of plurilateral agreements and create space for those types of agreements. But I also would note that we need a lot more work to be done to ensure that there's greater comfort with moving down that track. And there are legitimate concerns and worries by countries that are not ready to participate in that type of a process, who worry about being confronted with rules that they might not agree to down the road. I don't have time to go into all of that. I'll just put that on the table, but I think there are certainly ways we can address those types of concerns. Final point is we need leadership here. We need other countries to step forward. I think this institution for a long time has been driven by the United States. Of course, we can go back into history and look at the countries that were actually really most involved in actually designing this system. But I think we're now in a situation where the US has clearly said, we have some problems, we're stepping back. We need to rethink what we want to do ourselves. Fine. There are 163 other countries that are very engaged in trade, and I think they need to move forward. And I think it really falls on the big countries in the world economy and who have the most at stake in terms of the trade regime, which I would argue are the European Union and China, where they really need to be driving this process forward in a very open way. Not saying we're doing this to keep the US out, but I think we need to continue to have these types of constructive discussions, and somebody needs to take the lead on those. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. We'll discuss the issues Bernard put on the table. Let me now invite the next speaker, Professor Simon Evenett of St. Gallen University. Professor Evenett will discuss the topic of the rise of protectionism and the role of the WTO. Probably we may expect Professor Evenett to touch upon so-called Trump trade policy. Our title says Trumpism, but anyway, please.
TTP.
Thank you very much, and indeed I will say something about the Trump administration's policies. I'm going to make the case that you do not have to believe in America First policies to believe that the world trading system is now heavily distorted. I want to be understood. I am not arguing that the world trading system is closed like it was in the 1930s, but we as economists care about resource misallocation, and I would argue that there are plenty of other ways in which markets can be distorted and still be open, and that is exactly where we've come to. I will provide some data later. I'm going to answer a series of questions. How did this come about? Should we be surprised? Why are we worried about this now? What has gone wrong? And that's where I'll come back to the trade distortions. And what comes next? These are the points I will make. So how did this heavily distorted trading system come about? Well, it came about because the protectionist pressures that we saw in the last 10 years have taken advantage of the fact that the WTO rulebook is heavily incomplete. And even where there are rules, there are often lots of loopholes. And so what we have is a rulebook which is quite tight in some areas and weak in others, and especially in the areas of subsidies and subsidies embedded in national tax systems, particularly weak. And this is exactly what has been exploited by governments to prop up firms and to also boost their exporters. The second reason this came about is because of what I call the glass house syndrome. One of the reasons you have not seen lots of WTO disputes in this era is precisely because, as we say in English, people who live in glass houses do not throw stones. If you bring a dispute against my protectionism, I will bring one against yours. And we see this dynamic restraining the number of WTO disputes. Furthermore, the WTO rulebook, even in areas where we often think it's very tight, in fact isn't that tight. At the beginning of the financial crisis, it may surprise you to know that 85 members of the WTO could have raised their tariffs by the Smoot-Hawley amount and still be in compliance with their obligations. Okay? And so essentially this system, if you have a mental image of the WTO as nailing down and preventing all sorts of insane government policies, that's an exaggerated image. This is a very incomplete set of rules which have been, in my view, systematically exploited. So for me, when people say, how did the WTO have an effect on protectionism, I would retort with the question, how could it have had an effect, given the incomplete nature of the rules? Now, should we be surprised by this outcome? Not really. I make 2 points. First, this system was designed by some very thoughtful, forward-looking representatives of large powers who had very little intention of tying their own hands. And they knew exactly what they were doing when they created an incomplete set of rules. And it left them with considerable discretion, and they've exploited that. Secondly, even if you don't buy that argument, let's not forget that trade diplomats have had 20 years to figure out every single loophole, weakness in the system, and how to make end runs around it. Just look at the games which are played with dispute settlement in some of the key cases, and you'll see what I mean. So I am not at all surprised that when you put a system under pressure 20 years after it's been created, that the trade diplomats haven't figured out how to game it. That's their job. What do you think they were doing when they're thinking through how to fix problems on a short-term basis? So I'm not surprised by this outcome. Why are we suddenly worried about it now? Well, of course, I think now we have to talk about the double talk. During the crisis era, we had a very weak official monitoring exercise on protectionism, and this has systematically under-recorded the level of a number of trade distortions. We have developed this polite diplomatic fiction in Geneva that the protectionist dog did not bark. And this double talk only works as long as everyone is prepared to go along with it. The problem is we now have an administration in the United States, and I would argue the previous administration said similar things but more diplomatically. They simply do not buy the double talk anymore. Okay? They don't buy it. They argue that the system has many different deficiencies, and they are prepared to point this out. If you looked at yesterday morning's interventions by ministers at MC11, it's interesting. The formulation people were saying is that this is a good system, but it's not perfect. Well, that's already going some way towards acknowledging the Americans' concerns. But ultimately, we brought this problem upon ourselves by engaging in this double talk and engaging in this fiction about limited resort to trade distortions. And we now have a rogue player who is prepared to call other countries on this. Now, this rogue player is also doing, in my view, a number of dumb protectionist measures as well, but the simple fact is we should not be surprised by this. This is a wake-up call for some honesty and starting up again. Now, when it comes to what has gone wrong, let me give you some sense of this. My team has now documented over 13,500 public policy interventions around the world since November 2008. Over 2/3 of them are trade distortions. And for all of those 8,000 or 9,000 trade distortions, we have traced out using very disaggregated trade data, using information on when those measures were implemented and when they've been withdrawn, how much trade is potentially implicated by them. And what we have found in 2017 is that if you look at the G20 exporters, over 80% of their exports compete in a foreign market against at least one trade distortion. And if you break it down and ask how many different trade distortions they compete against, you will find that as we've gone through the crisis era, the number of trade distortions that firms are competing against has progressively increased. And this scale of this problem is significant. If you also do the same analysis for trade reforms, you find about 23% of G20 exports competes in foreign markets against, or in situations where trading conditions have improved. So there is some good news, that unfortunately is about 3 times as much bad news. And this is the problem. And this type of information, I think, can no longer be buried. When you go from export shares affected onto impact on different types of countries, we now have studies which show the impact of foreign trade protectionism on the least developed countries, holding back their exports by about 1/3. We now have a study which my colleagues and I are putting out today, which shows that foreign protectionism has held back EU export growth outside of the Union by between 10 to 20 percentage points, depending on which member state you're looking at. We also have independent evidence, not done by my team, which has looked at the impact of the scaling up of Chinese export incentives, mainly again through their national tax systems. The impacts at the margin are quite significant, and so the evidence piles up. And this is why we have a problem, and why it does not surprise me that Mr. Lighthizer said the things he said yesterday. I don't endorse what he has to say or his approach, but I can understand someone looking at the facts perhaps differently. But I think he's looking at the facts and concluding something is wrong. And on that, I would agree with him. Now, the last question I want to ask is what next? And this is what brings us to Trump. The trigger for what could happen next. Well, I think the next big trigger, given the Trump administration, is going to be the US midterm elections. Because essentially, Mr. Trump will probably need some type of trade policy-related victory, as he sees it. Okay? So who's going to pay the price for this victory? Well, the obvious targets are the Chinese. Okay? It's not for nothing that the American president went to Beijing in this last trip, and his people did not come with a list of things they wanted the Chinese to fix. They didn't even request that the Chinese do anything, which is strange because the Chinese were expecting that. There was no demands made of the Chinese. The Chinese were baffled as to why this is. And I would submit to you for one very simple reason. If the Americans had asked for something the Chinese could do, the Chinese would have announced it. The Americans would then own that compromise. And this president can't own a compromise on trade before a major election. So one flashpoint, I think, will be US-Chinese relations potentially. Another flashpoint is, of course, the NAFTA negotiations, which could deteriorate further at any point in time. Perhaps if you look out over the next few years, one case we should be watching in the WTO is the Chinese market economy status case, where the Americans and the Europeans have denied Chinese market economy status to China, and China believes they were promised that. We can get it in the Q&A, we can go into whether or not that was a sensible strategic move by the Europeans and the Americans, but this is going to be a litmus test for the Chinese in terms of support for the WTO system, and so we could have a trigger there. So, as I look forward, I mean, you can see the picture, I think, probably gets worse before it gets better, but as we say in English, the night is always darkest just before dawn. And I think we are, the current status quo, or the status quo we have at the moment at the WTO, which is essentially going nowhere, and we are essentially moving sideways, isn't delivering either. And I suspect what we will need is, there will have to be a scary moment, which will hopefully induce the big players to come and sit round a table. The fear I have is whether those big players are willing to tie their hands in binding accords. I don't see much evidence of that. And secondly, can a Trump administration own a compromise and take it back to their own supporters? I'm not so sure on that either. Both of those thoughts do not make me very optimistic about the WTO being a place where major trade problems get resolved in the near term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Evenett. You mentioned through your study and also other evidences saying the protectionism is on the rise. But whenever we have a G20 summit meeting, along with WTO Director General and OECD, they are saying that we are really having, standstill, that kind of commitment. So it is a little bit disparity between their argument and your evidences, right?
Correct. I mean, essentially, what the WTO monitors are some import restrictions.
Which is reported to the WTO.
The stuff reported by the WTO Secretariat is a limited range of trade distortions. And you have to understand that the WTO seeks verification for almost everything it reports. So if a member government decides not to verify a trade distortion, I suspect the WTO doesn't add it in. So in that sense, I think their monitoring is a little bit compromised by the circumstances under which they operate.
Okay, well, we'll discuss that also more. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Chung, Vice President of Kiev. Dr. Chung will address on the topic of relationship between WTO and regional trade agreements. Dr. Chung, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting, having me here. Actually, I was one of the organizers, so I'm not invited.
You invited yourself.
When we first designed this session, we had these prominent speakers, but we thought about the title of this session, and especially on the Trumpism. Should we put it in or not? I mean, we thought maybe we are giving too much credit to Mr. Trump. But on the second thought, we thought this Trumpism is not about just Mr. Donald Trump, but it's about some of this sort of the sentiment, anti-globalization sentiment, or some of the protectionism across the globe. And so, yeah, Mr. Trump is saying the America first, but some other countries are also saying their own country first. That's one thing. And another aspect of the Trumpism we thought about was maybe we can, to a certain degree, understand why this Trump administration is doing this kind of trade policy, and we should give a thought and some attention to that in order to talk about the challenges to the multilateral trading system. So yeah, as the U.S. is saying, maybe there are some unfair trade practices across the world. Maybe there should be some solutions and answers to those the questions. And we know that the U.S. has been a key player and has been pushing forward, for the formation of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But now the U.S. is out. So that's something we can see from the Trump administration's trade policy in terms of how the world trading system is going to move forward without the United States. So in the APEC summit, the Japan and other TPP 11 countries announced that they will go without the United States with the CPTPP, comprehensive and progressive TPP. In a word, what they are saying is that we'll go forward without the United States, but still we're going to be waiting for the United States to come back, in the future. So they tried not to touch upon the TPP text. They agreed with the United States already. We also see something similar in the APEC. There is the initiative called FTAP, the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific. Initially, that idea actually came from the United States, but then later, the China took it over, and then they wanted to go on to the negotiation, but the U.S. opposed to it because at the time the United States was pushing TPP forward in a herd. So it was understood, but now I don't know what the United States is going to move in terms of the other RTAs. The reason why RTAs, except for in addition to the TPP, we have seen the TTIP between the EU and the US, and also there's the RCEP among the ASEAN 10 countries plus Korea, Japan, China, and India, Australia, New Zealand, 16 countries. They are still negotiating, but we do not expect a big outcome out of the RCEP because of the low level of the liberalization. Of course, that can be playing as a platform for the Asian trade regime, but it's not going to have a big impact in terms of the trade liberalization because of some members like India, you know what I mean, and some of those CLM countries, the least developed countries in membership. And then now we have, I personally have the high hope for the Pacific Alliance, which is very small right now, but it is increasingly expanding its membership or the observers. So I think it has a great potential with some flexibilities. But it may take some time, and it has a long way to go. So the RTAs have popped up because of the WTO, the multilateral trading system. It's not perfect, and wanted to deal with some of the issues like spaghetti bowl issues and so on. But the RTAs can actually achieve the goal of the market access, but it cannot do anything about the subsidy problems. For example, we talk about it at the WTO. So, are we going to be still better without the WTO? Obviously that's not a question. Maybe you can say that obviously no. The reason why we could talk about some of those RTAs or some of those FTAs, it's because we have WTO, the world's global, the global rule system. Without that, the RTAs it will be groundless. So I think it's very important to have this WTO as the key, the framework, and then. If the WTO system fails, then my concern is that we are talking about the inclusive growth and even inclusive trade, and talking about the MSMEs, micro and small and medium enterprises. Probably later we will have to talk about the MSMCs, micro, small, and medium countries' problems without this, because these days it's becoming much more political beyond economics or the trade issues. So it's becoming more of the power contest. So we need the WTO, even if we are not getting a lot out of the WTO at this moment. I think we should actually have that. One comment on the protectionism and the U.S. trade policy. I agree with the Simon about the U.S. needs some kind of win in terms of the trade policies before the midterm election. Mr. Trump has been doing this China bashing a lot, but nothing has been done on China. I think the U.S. is trying to take a detour. So because of right now, some experts are saying that the biggest risks, one of the biggest risks to the world economy is the North Korean nuclear issue. So it's a political issue, that dictates the trade or economic issues. So I think there's a reason behind the Trump administration taking a detour, and they take a detour to the renegotiation of NAFTA and the amendment negotiation with the Korea, the cross FTA. So it's a kind of the sort of the relatively easier targets than the taking on China directly. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chung. You mentioned RTAs, but it can include bilateral FTAs too, right? So in that context, maybe EU and Japan FTA, what they call different names, but it can play some roles in stimulating the other parts of the trading system. Okay, anyway, so now I invite Professor Danny Leipziger of George Washington University. We asked the question to him to cover the role of small open economies in the multilateral trading system. I think in terms of small open economies, I was kind of alluding to a kind of country like Korea. I mean, Bernard mentioned China and EU may be able to take the leadership instead of United States, but we are suggesting the possibility whether some middle power countries or small open economies get together to have a collective leadership rather than big leadership. I hope Professor Leipziger can mention a little bit about on that issue too. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Kiep, for inviting me to this panel. I will try to get to the question posed in a moment, but before I do that, I think the Trumpism in the title is a pretty provocative title, and I would like to also be provocative and propose 5 inconvenient truths, to paraphrase Al Gore, about the trade regime globally that we are currently seeing. The first is that globalization that occurred between 1990 and 2008 intoxicated a lot of people with the benefits of trade and the benefits of global value chains, and people paid very little attention to domestic consequences of that type of globalization. And I think if you look back to the 80s and 90s in the U.S., when a country ended up capturing market shares very rapidly, there was something called voluntary export restraints, mostly aimed at Japan, which was a way to deal with the domestic consequences of very rapid globalization. Since then, we have not seen much, and as other speakers have said, the WTO has been largely ineffective in that respect. Number 2, I would say that domestic governments, particularly my own, and since we're talking about Trumpism, have been very weak in dealing with the problems created for the losers of globalization, right? Joe Stiglitz wrote his book almost 20 years ago. Danny Roderick has been writing quite a bit about this. And it's incumbent upon domestic policy to deal in one way or another with the consequences that are negative, even though the net benefits are positive from globalization. I think national governments have not been very good, particularly in America, in dealing with that. Number 3, I would argue that globalization's rules have lagged behind globalization per se, right? I mean, we've seen a lot of benefits of trade, but we haven't seen the management of the system evolving commensurately with that. And I would just point to dumping as one example. I don't think it requires 3 years of analysis to decide whether or not someone is dumping. I think that can be done in 3 months. And if the WTO can't do it, I'm sure Simon and his team could do it. And so they should outsource it, independent outsourcing. Is Korea dumping? Is China dumping? Deal with it. If you can't, if you have to go to the green room for a couple of years to talk about this, then you shouldn't be surprised when there's a lot of pushback against the WTO and against globalization. Number 3, I would point a finger at multinational corporations who have benefited tremendously from globalization. They've milked the system left, right, and center, whether it's through parking profits, transfer pricing, whatever, the net result of which is that they have robbed national treasuries, particularly in the U.S., of the necessary resources to deal with some of the downsides of globalization, right? So if Apple is parking its profits in Ireland and the Treasury can't capture it, how is the U.S. supposed to pay for some of the labor market distortions? So I think there's been a hypocritical view on the part of corporations to a large extent. And I'm on a World Economic Forum Council that's supposed to look at growth and social inclusion, but that is in one ambit. When you go to Davos, you don't hear this, right? The corporations are still very happy making their profits. Number 5, I think, and this perhaps is the most controversial, I think the global community has largely turned a blind eye to what is known as state capitalism. If China were the number 13 economy in the world, I as an economist wouldn't particularly care whether or not they were subsidizing directly or indirectly certain industries, whether they were financing acquisitions with state banks. If you're the number 13, I just picked that randomly, I don't care. If you're the second largest economy in the world, I do care. And I think over the last 20 years, there has not been a commensurate ratcheting up of responsibilities on China. Joining the WTO, great, it was useful at the time, useful for China, useful for the world, perhaps more useful for China. But I think that we are now in a world in which the U.S. is ailing domestically, politically, and China is rising, but we're not holding them accountable for state capitalism. So just to end off on these 5 truths, I think the conclusion that I draw from it is that you can not expect countries, particularly the U.S., to act in the way that many people here in Buenos Aires would like to see it act on global trade, because it is not dealing domestically with its adjustment problems and the downsides of globalization. And I think that's something that's missing often in the discussion of international trade, which is that governments that are weak in dealing with the consequences of international trade where they are negative would not be forthcoming globally. So on the second question, the way I'd like to phrase that is, what is the current structure and configuration of the world economy mean for emerging markets in developing countries? We know that exporting is the way to develop. We know this because countries tend to be poor and don't have enough domestic demand. They need to reach scale. They need to reach large markets. The reason that Korea has been so successful is that they had the open U.S. market, right? Yeah, there were some frictions from time to time, but without the U.S. market, Korea wouldn't be where it is today. Where are those markets today for the emerging market and developing economies? Where are they going to make progress? If you look at the trade regimes around the world, there's been a lot of action on tariff reduction. There's still some areas that need work. But if you're the Côte d'Ivoire, and you study development economics 30 or 40 years ago, you learned that they produce cocoa, but they can't get into developed markets with their more developed processes of chocolate or something else. Is that totally different today than it was in 1980? Probably not, right? So I think developing countries are going to look for new sources of growth. They're going to look domestically. They're going to try to generate more domestic drivers of growth, and they're going to start looking at things that a few decades ago we would have considered anathema, such as industrial policies. Almost every country has some sort of a plan, including Argentina, to develop new industries. And you can do it in a smart way or in a import substituting not so smart way. But I think the global environment, the global community has to deal with the consequences of the current situation, which is that a lot of countries are going to look for second best alternatives. Finally, do I think that there's going to be a new configuration of countries that are going to take the lead? Frankly, I don't see that happening. I think that it is unlikely also that the EU and China are going to come together without the U.S. and shape a global environment for trade and finance that is working well. Parenthetically, I should say that I think the global community has done much better, not perfectly by a long shot, in dealing with international finance issues than they have with international trade issues. I think there's much more of a conversation among the like-minded in that category. So the only forum that we have really is the G20, a group that I think did very well in 2008-9 in preventing global recession, but a group that I don't think has a common enough set of interests to help reshape the global economic and financial system. And I think if you just look at the major players, you can see, forgetting about Trumpism for the moment, that the US, Europe, and Japan have some common understanding of how they'd like the world to work. I'm in the camp with Danny Roderick in thinking that China has done remarkably well using the system that was out there, but they have, apart from the growth stimulus and the fact that they've generated a lot of global economic activity, I don't think they've invested sufficiently in trying to keep that system healthy. And so the idea that they would be labeled a market economy, I think, is a joke. And I'm not a Trump supporter, I'm not a Republican, but I think that you can't argue that a state capitalist economy of the size of China is a market economy. I don't see that. So I think I'm in the somewhat negative camp, and I think the solutions to international trade problems rely tremendously on the capacity of governments to deal domestically with their issues of inequality and job losses, et cetera, which will only get worse due to disruptive technology and other things that are unrelated to trade. And trade often gets the brunt of the blame for job losses, where in the United States, for example, most of the evidence shows that, at least 2/3 of the job losses have nothing to do with trade. They have to do with technology. But it's a convenient target to look at trade. But I think the trade regime has made itself a convenient target. And it's made itself a convenient target by not dealing satisfactorily with some of the issues that other members of the panel have mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Leipziger. You mentioned that maybe G20 can handle much better for financial issues than trade issues. I think that this is an obvious result of the fact that IMF has a board system, so they can decide anything using the board. But at the WTO, G20 is only 20 countries out of 164 countries. The BRICS country wisely argue that whenever we want to talk trade within G20, they said, well, it's not the place for talking about G20 because we need 164 countries consensus. So structurally, inherently, because of consensus principle, this, this kind of forum cannot work. I mean, this is a reality we have to face. Well, anyway, lastly, but not least, I now invite Dr. Chung So, Senior Research Fellow of Kiev. Dr. So will discuss the topic of possible ways. I don't know whether there is a possible ways to negotiate and cooperate in new issues and the new trade policies beyond MC11. Very long title of the question. Dr. So, please.
Okay, thank you, the Trade Minister, Mr. Brock. And today I'm talking about the WTO, the multilateral trading system without United States. And in doing so, I would like to summarize my talks by giving several key points. Okay, first, WTO member need to recognize the current situation very clearly. I think now is a time that we cannot expect the U.S. leadership in the WTO multilateral trading system, as well as Doha round negotiation. And, I think all of you in this room knows very well that the role of the United States is very important and also critical for getting the successful conclusion of Doha round. But the Trump administration and has led the United States in the stepping from the back its traditional role at the head of the WTO, which means not only a vacuum in leadership of the WTO, but also the throwing the future of the WTO in disorder or in question. So I do not mention this issue the more because I believe all of you in this room knows very well, and it is also very clear. And second point, in this situation, so the problem is that no member country in the WTO or no any other country cannot be as a substitute for United States. Although the Danny, also the Hoekman is said, China is the big country, but still, I think the GDP in China in the last year just 75% of the debt of the United States. So the United States GDP in the last year, the $18.6 trillion, and which is almost more than the 70% bigger than the debt of the Chinese GDP in the last year. And so we still need a big market for trading in the global economy. And also on the other hand, I agree the European Union also the very leading country in the WTO system, but at the same time, I believe European Union is really far from the United States in terms of setting the negotiation agenda and also leading the multilateral negotiation in the WTO system. And so in this situation, what can we expect? I think if we cannot find a way out of this situation, or we cannot prepare for worst scenario, and then I think the current WTO system will remain as a vegetable, just breathing, not action. And thing is, time is not solution because current WTO system is not a sleeping beauty. And also, Princess Charming is not never coming, at least within the next 10 years. And so, what should WTO member do? And broadly speaking, I think there are two options. One is just waiting for Princess Charming, but as I said already, that is not a good solution. And in that process, maybe we have to take some risk of dismantling the WTO system. Like probably Mr. Trump decide to pull down or withdraw the United States from the current WTO system. So what is the next option is just we need to think about the following two directions. Number one is some new format of current multilateral negotiation. And the second is the content of negotiation. Let me talk about the first issue. And I believe it is very difficult to expect any kinds of meaningful outcome through the current multilateral negotiation, which more than 160 member countries all participate in the negotiation. I think such kind of negotiation format cannot be maintained, and also that cannot be expected to getting any good result. And so current negotiation format need to be changed. Like right now, the WTO member countries should launch some more various kinds of negotiation format, including the bilateral approach. We have already lots of good history on that because we have already know some code approach in the Tokyo round in 1970s. Also, we get some successful story in getting the good compromise in terms of like ITA, the Information Technology Agreements. So there are, I think this time is really we need a new approach on the negotiation format. And also in regard to the content of negotiation, we need to give us some carrot to the developed country. Because there are, right now, most of the developed countries, including the particularly United States, think about current negotiation content in the WTO system is very, very unbalanced or unfair. And because the most developed countries think that the developing country really request excessive S&D in every negotiation of the current Doha round. So I think we need to modify our view on S&Ds, so special and differential treatment in clause. And in that sense, the Hong Kong ministerial declaration also say that, quotation, developing member countries declare themselves in a position to do so, okay? And at the same time, the new negotiation agenda, new agenda is really needed. And for example, e-commerce or micro and the small, the medium-sized enterprise issue also need to be incorporated in the current Doha round system. And that is a useful way to rebalance cost and benefit from the negotiation between the developing and developed countries. And let me close my talk by saying like that, now is time that all the WTO member countries should think about the multilateral trading system without United States. And also, we have to think about the WTO is not a sleeping beauty, and also there is no Prince Charming. So we need new approach, really different from the past one. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. So. I'd like to open the floor, but any panelists want to make a brief comment to each other or some questions? If you have, anybody want to add something? No? Okay, then I will open the. We have to finish sharply at 10:30, so please raise your hand if you have questions and identify yourself as brief as possible and try to make questions rather than comments. Okay, somebody back there?
Is this working? Yeah. Hi, I'm Pierre Sauvé from the World Bank Group. I just want to make a very short comment in support of Professor Leipziger's observation that at the end of the day, if governments fail to equip their citizens with the ability to cope with change, we shouldn't expect those countries to be able to actually show any leadership in global governance. And the United States is largely failing to do that. I'm from Canada. We share a border. Our economies are completely integrated. We have no conversation of that nature in our country. There are voices that question globalization, but for the most part, Canadians do not feel insecure because there's a social safety net that takes care of a lot of the anxieties, I think, that are driving the increasing questioning of citizens towards globalization and therefore trade. Quick question to Bernard. Bernard, you expressed some misgivings or some concerns about the possibility that plurilateral negotiations might be bad for some countries or may exclude some countries. But is not the solution to the current travails of the WTO to promote open plurilateralism, keep the door open, allow every country to learn from the negotiating journey, and then decide as a sovereign nation whether or not those rules are in their interests? I mean, given the scale of differences in the system, I don't see any other alternative than that. And then sovereign nations will decide whether or not those rules that are the result of negotiations are acceptable or not. Why is that risky? I just wanted to know your views on that.
Okay, I will collect some more questions. And the gentleman in the middle, yes.
Thank you. I'm Hong Song from China. I think this is a very interesting panel discussions and a lot of talking about China. I have two questions and one comment. One question is for Simon and Hoekman and also my friends from Korea. It's what's wrong with China in terms of trade and investment? Because a lot of discussion, it seems to me a lot of bad things was done by China. The second question is for the Professor Danny. You argue that China is not a market economy. Could you give us a very detail about your definitions of what is a market economy, what is not, and in what extensions China is not a market economy? One comment is that I don't think China can be a leaders for the WTOs because China is first thing is that China is now interested to be a leaders for WTOs. I think could be a key members because China is the largest traders in the world. But in terms of leadership, I don't think so. And I think maybe, yeah, some of the middle countries like Korea could be a good candidate for that. Because China is a developing countries, especially in terms of per capita levels, we still have a lot of the a long way to go for us to development, to catch up with other leading countries. Thank you.
Thank you. You? Yes, please. Here. Here. The microphone.
Thank you. Is it on? I'm Alan Deardorff from the University of Michigan in the United States. I agree with Danny that what we really need is for countries to be able to deal with the adverse effects of trade, and that some countries, I gather, do it better. Well, almost any country does it better than the U.S. But I'm wondering, there's no way the WTO, we're talking about a new paradigm for the WTO, can handle that. But it does have a feature that has always had in it, the safeguards clause, which is exactly intended to deal with the adverse consequences of imports, and yet it isn't used very much. Trump is talking about using it, and the press, when they speak of this, say, "Oh, he wants to use this policy that hasn't been used in many years," and that's true, actually. But why hasn't it been used? So I'm wondering if anybody on the panel has thoughts as to what could be done to kind of make that more effective. My own thought is that the fact that the safeguards tariffs have to be non-discriminatory turns out to be problematic, since the trade frictions we get tend to be surges of exports from particular countries, and maybe that's the problem. But it seems like that's the one area where the WTO could, in principle, do something to help with that problem.
One more question, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond, and then we have another round of questions. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bach, and also to all the panelists, both Bernard and Simon, and any others. Getting the WTO to another level of discussion would obviously be a very useful thing, so they could actually approach substance and generate some reflection around serious issues, current and future. We haven't managed to do that. Part of it, as we know, is because WTO trade officials are always in a negotiating mode and a negotiating framework. Everything they say is put on paper and reported. What you're suggesting is what APEC has been doing for years. It's moving towards a sort of more soft law approach so that you can actually get people to discuss without being afraid to have their positions recorded as official government positions. Bernard, it's a great thing to say it. How do you get there? What format do you use? What groupings? How do you introduce reflective process around, based on soft law into a hard law organization? Would WTO be willing to look at some of the APEC ways of proceeding and innovations? Can you imagine discussions that are off the record? Is that what you're thinking about? Can you imagine the use of Chatham House rules? I mean, just, I'm sure you thought of this, and we've had an E15 group on this, but it's never really gone anywhere. So what are you really thinking of in 2 sentences?
Okay, I changed my mind. One more question. Somebody who raised the... Yeah, you.
He has the microphone.
Okay, thank you very much for a very stimulating panel. I was wondering, looking at Danny Leipziger's 5 inconvenient truths, I could identify very similar claims to the ones that the Trump administration is making in a more complex and subtle way. But and I think you have a point, not trying to dismiss everything that that has been said about, or all the contentious points that have been brought up by the U.S. election and Trump's election. Now, the question I have is it really on the domestic level that the U.S. can try to create or foster more support for trade, or isn't there much more to do at the WTO level? You mentioned transfer pricing. Now, I know that these are contentious issues here in this arena, but I feel that there is much more that the WTO could do to try to create more linkages between trade and inequality. So I'd like to have your take on this.
Okay, we'll open the second round of interaction, but I think Bernard and Simon and Danny, you should respond first, and then maybe Dr. Chung and Dr. So can add. Okay, Bernard, you can go first.
Okay, so on these various, so let me start with Pierre's question on open plurilateralism as the solution. So I definitely think that is the way to go. I've written a whole bunch of papers on this with Petros Mavroidis in terms of how you can actually do this within the current system of rules. The big challenge here is to get beyond the groups of countries getting together and doing something which is applied on a non-discriminatory basis. Right? So to go beyond the ITA type of an approach. And I think the problem we have here with respect to plurilateral agreements more narrowly defined, such as the government procurement agreement, is you need everybody to sign off on those things, right? So we have the consensus rule that applies to everybody has to agree that a subset of countries can move on. And I think what we don't have, and I think this is where where there are some legitimate concerns in terms of process, is the kind of things that you would like to see, like open plurilateralism, ensure that everybody is part of the equation in terms of being able to discuss, et cetera. That's not written down anywhere, right? So we don't really have a good set of working practice. Goes back to the working practices type of issue, which I raised before. We don't really have kind of an agreed process as to how you would actually do that. And I think the problem I see is that because it is so difficult to do that, essentially what countries are telling each other is don't do this in the WTO, go off and sign a plurilateral trade agreement, right? So I think that is the real issue, and that's the real challenge we need to deal with. So just to take an example, so if you think about the TISA negotiations as ideally being an open plurilateral, which is I think what it should have been, should be, who knows where it is. But the way that negotiation actually then proceeded is everybody who was not intending to join was simply left out of the room. Right, so I think that is a mistake, right? So I think what you really should be doing is you should be ensuring that that is actually an open process, right? Nobody has anything to hide in terms of what rules are being negotiated. Once you get down to actually the nitty-gritty of exchanging market access concessions, of course, that should only be the countries involved in that process. But if we're talking about the rules, everybody should be able to hear what the discussion is about, and that wasn't the case. In fact, the Secretariat was kept out of the room, right? So I think that is really the wrong way of going about this process. Let me skip China. I'll leave China to the others. On the safeguards point, I think it's an interesting question. So for me, whatever you think and whatever you expect to come out of this dispute with respect to giving China market economy status, the fact of the matter, of course, is when it comes to things like anti-dumping, you can pretty much do what you want to do, right? You just redefine the rules, the criteria. I mean, dumping is one area where, to echo what Simon said, where trade officials are super innovative in terms of essentially doing what they think needs to be done in terms of getting to an outcome. So there's lots of alternative instruments to actually deal with the negative consequences of what a particular country is doing with respect to what is perceived to be unfair competition, what is perceived to be dumping. The safeguards issue is, I think, the way you were putting it was, I think, what negotiators were trying to do in the Uruguay round. And the fact that safeguards haven't been used all that much is because the few countries that used safeguards early on in the WTO process, where that was knocked down by the appellate body. Because the appellate body took a really narrow view of what was written in the text, and they had to say, okay, unforeseen developments. Well, was this really unforeseen? Not you could have foreseen it. So boom, off it goes. So I think a lot of the intention of shifting from the VER regime to a safeguard regime, which was part of the deal in the Uruguay round, never really materialized because of that. On Sherry specific, how would you actually do this? I would start with committees, right? So put committees to work in terms of actually asking them, what is your objective? What are you here for? What are you supposed to do? Get them and then ask the question, do you actually have the resources and the information you need to actually do what we collectively agree we should be doing? So that's one way of starting a conversation within the current institutional structure. The other thing is I think we need to be much more open in terms of actually discussing issues like the dispute settlement process. And that could be Chatham House rules, but it should be everybody in the room and saying, okay, so what really are the issues? Right now, I'm an economist, but when I talk to some of my legal friends in terms of what has been coming out of the appellate body in terms of case law, there are a lot of people who think a lot of this stuff is, not particularly coherent. Right? So there's a lot of things that need to be discussed which don't seem to be getting discussed that need to be discussed. So that I think is just something where chairs of committees, of councils would say, okay, guys, we put this on the agenda. But then we get back to the working practice, which is consensus. So then somebody's going to say, oh, no, I don't want this on the agenda. Right? And I think that really is kind of the crux of the problem that needs to be broken in terms of dealing with some of these issues.
Okay, Simon, could you go briefly?
Bernard has done 2/3 of my job, so I will not repeat. I'll go straight to the question about China and investment. And I think that here we have to differentiate between Chinese policies towards inward investment versus outward investment. When it comes to inward investment, I mean, the requirements that foreign firms tie up with local firms, of course, is a source of tension. But I think the biggest single thing which does China no favors is that it's extremely untransparent what the policy mix is. If you try and trace the introduction of a policy from a state council directive to the ministry level, to the provincial level, and down to the town level, each of these levels, there is very, very little paper trail. And I think it just creates this incredible suspicion that the implementing jurisdiction is just up to no good. So here's an area where I think the Chinese could actually do themselves a hell of a lot of good by actually having a much more transparent system of regulations which foreigners can track. Because then at least we can talk about facts rather than fears. With respect to overseas investments, here I think there is a real concern about Chinese firms being state-financed or supported in these overseas acquisitions and the like. Now, it should be said that China is not the only country in the world which has done extremely creative things with state banks and export credit agencies in the last 10 years. I mean, there are other countries I could name as well. But again, you hear concerns about, is this Chinese firm that's buying a German firm or a Swiss firm, what are its links to the state? Again, all of these things could be just could be a lot more transparent and would help help diminish, I'm not saying eliminate, fears. And I think this is an area where there's a lot that China could do to help its own image abroad. And there's also a lot that other countries can do to improve their behavior as well.
Okay. Danny, you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I was somewhat provocative on China, so I expected some questions. I guess what's wrong with China? Nothing except that behaviors have to match size. So if you go back to 1990, look at the size of the Chinese economy, look at 2000, look at 2010, look at 2017. Behaviors have not changed at the same speed as has the Chinese economy. I'm not an expert in the legalities of market economy, but if I were to do it as an exercise, as a mental exercise, I would take Denmark and I would take China, and I would ask you to look at 6 or 7 categories and decide whether or not, Denmark and China have similar policies with respect to capital controls and the exchange rate, labor market conditions, capital allocation by state banks, industrial policy as embedded in the Made in China 2025 report from the State Council, 5, intellectual property rules, 6, regulation, particularly on service sector, foreign service sector. So if you take, and I'm just putting a half a dozen things out there, you set up a little column, put Denmark or any other country that you like that you consider a market economy, and then you put China, and then you see how they relate. And I don't think China is going to come out looking like Denmark. Therefore, as a very simple exercise, I think we can find many impediments in the way the Chinese economy is managed that are contrary to market principles. And again, as I said, if China were the number 20 economy in the world, it wouldn't matter. But as the second largest economy in the world and soon to be the largest economy in the world, it does matter. So the pressure that you feel that the U.S. should exert leadership, which I think it should, but as I mentioned, I think its domestic problems dominate its ability to be this global leader. If they can't be, then who next? And unfortunately, I believe that China's policies globally have been deficient in showing leadership because in a number of areas, they're not up to the Danish standard. Is anyone from Denmark in the room? You can buy me a cortado later.
Okay, Dr. Chung, you want?
Yes.
Yeah. Be brief. Yeah.
Yes. First of all, I'm speaking on personal capacity, not representing Kiev or Korea. I'd like to credit the China's contribution to the world economy, but as Danny and the people also mentioned about China's state economy and some of the subsidies and IPR related policies. I think it's a political intention, the overweights the market economy principles in some areas at least. I mean, I'm not the Trump supporter or the Republican. I'm not even the U.S. citizen. But I think there are some points. And also recently, China and Korea has some problems, and it is about basically the originating from the THAAD, which is the missile defense system. It's a security issue. Of course, China is not saying that the government is doing nothing about the trade, the restricting measures, but the world is watching the China's practices much more carefully and closely these days than maybe 10 years ago. So I think there are some issues, and maybe some of those practices are being viewed as not fair to some countries or maybe to the world. Just one just comment on.
We are running out of time, but
I'll keep my mouth shut.
No, I'm not saying this.
No. Okay, I can skip that. Yeah.
Dr. So,
just
1 minute.
Yeah.
Less than 1 minute.
I think that everything has its own advantage and disadvantage, and so does the pro-retail approach. And so I know the pro-retail approach is perfect, but it is also true that the pro-retail approach is more efficient than in terms of getting the small agreement rather than the multilateral approach. And so I think the pro-retail approach is important. And what I really worry about that, we have already spent lots of time in getting the unrealistic, unideal solution in WTO multilateral system. So now it's time we need to change itself.
Okay, we are really approaching to an end, but I promise to give a gentleman the opportunity to speak. Can you, without expecting answers, but you can ask question anyway.
So I'm not sure that's the right standard. But I wanted to ask something on, to me, it seems to me that the biggest problem that the system has with the US is not that the US is being protectionist or that the US is blocking anything in the WTO. The main problem we're having is that the US has stopped to engage completely. Now, a number of speakers have said the way forward is go for plurilateral. I cannot think of any situation where you could have a plurilateral that really makes sense without the US. Maybe you can come up with examples. I cannot think of any situation where the US will join any plurilateral at this stage. Maybe I'm wrong. But in that case, how can you think that a plurilateral approach might be the way forward? Thank you.
Yeah, just why don't you say?
Just quickly, I can think of lots of issues where you can move ahead without the US. As long as, like Pierre said, it has to be an open process. But take services as an example. Why can't we right now? And again, this is assuming that China actually wants to engage in a discussion on services. Why can't we just get that process going? And again, it's open. The US representatives can sit there. If they don't want to engage, they don't engage. But at least start that discussion.
Just one comment. The US used to view the WTO as a strategic tool, but the US turned it into a strategic target. So I think maybe we should think about both scenarios with the US and without the US.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, but I want to close. But Professor Diodov mentioned about safeguard, right? But I think from now on, starting with the United States, they want to use more safeguard as a means of so-called anti-circumvention approach, rather than safeguard per se, because for certain items, like the U.S. is investigating Korea's export of washing machine. We are export directly, but we are indirectly. So for that, they want to apply safeguard. So maybe in the future, maybe we can see more frequent usage of safeguard in a way of anti-dumping measures. I know this is my just thinking out of my head. Well, I want to conclude. I think this is an excellent session, I guess. So why don't you join us applauding the excellent panelist discussion. I also thank audience for lively interventions with our panelists. Thank you very much. We'll close the session. Thank you.
Thank you.